So now that we know a bit more about spies, let's come back to mocks and also to these empty functions which we create here in general. Whenever you create such an empty function, you can actually pass a function to the fn method here. And this function which you pass here will then be used as an implementation for this dummy function that is created. By default, as mentioned, it's an empty function that doesn't do anything, but sometimes you want some test-specific behavior, and you can then pass a function to fn to create such a spy function, which still keeps track of executions and so on, but which has some behavior. It's not really something we need here for the logger, but it is something that can help us here in io.test.js. Because here we indeed might be interested in finding out which arguments were passed to write file. We want to make sure that our test data was passed to it specifically. And we also might want to make sure that our file name is respected. If we take a look at io.js though, we see that creating that path, that full path, is a bit more complex, and we're actually using another built-in module for that. So we have another dependency here on code that we don't own. That's not per se bad. It's also not code that manipulates anything on the file system or in a database, but we still might want to mock it away, primarily also to simplify our test here. And that's how you should think about testing in general. Be creative and find out how you can simplify your test and how you can write testing code that really allows you to test what you want to test. And here I want to test whether write file was called with the data we pass to write data and with the file name. And the file name should be somewhere in the path that is created. That's what we care about. So to simplify this and to get the test we want, what we can do here is we can also mock away path, the path module which we are using here in io.js. And there we care about the join method. You might have other tests in other files where you also have other methods you might care about. Then you can also add specific replacements in those other files. But here in io.test.js, I want to mock away the path and I care about the replacement of the join method. However, I'm not fine with the default of getting an empty function that just keeps track of executions. Because I want to create a join method that returns a storage path, but I want to simplify the function so that the return storage path in the end is just the file name. Because that then allows me to check whether the file name is used in write file because we use the storage path there. So if the storage path is just the file name, checking that will be simple. Of course, that would be incorrect if we really would want to store the file there, because we need the full file path for that. But since we don't execute the actual write file method anyways, we don't have to worry about that. Again, think about what you want to test. So therefore, I want to replace the join method. And with vmock and also with jestmock, this can easily be done by passing a second argument, which is a function, to the mock method. This allows you to set your own replacements, your own implementation. By default, as I mentioned, vtest and jest will go to the module and replace all functions with empty functions. If you pass a function as a second argument to the mock method, then in this function you can return an object which will instead be used as a replacement for the module you are mocking away. So in this case, for path. And then here I want to replace the join method, and therefore you could think that you just add join here, but unfortunately it's not that easy. Instead you have to add a default key, which is an object, and then there you have your join method. And this is required because for the path module, we're actually importing it like this, and that means we're using the default export of that module. On the contrary, here we are using a named export. Promises is a named export, but here we're using the default export, and therefore we have to replace the join method in that default export object, and that is done by adding the default key, and this has to be named default. That's not up to you. So we provide the default key in that object which we return here, and then default itself holds an object, and there we can set up our join method, either like this, or like this. Doesn't matter here where we're not using the this keyword. And then here in join, we can return whatever we want to return. And here, what I do want to return is in the end the test file name. Now for this, I know that join takes an infinite amount of arguments, and we can use the REST parameters syntax for that. That's default JavaScript. If that is totally new to you, definitely check out some dedicated JavaScript resources like my complete guide first. This in the end just gathers all the arguments we get, potentially super long list, into one array. And then here we want to get the last element of that array, which we can get by accessing args and then args.length -1. -1 because the index starts at 0 and length is the full length. So this returns the last element of the arguments we get, and the last element will always be the file name. So in the end, now join just returns the file name for our tests, nowhere else but for our tests, and therefore we know that for our tests, storage path will be the file name. So we mocked away this external code to simplify our test, because now we know that write file should receive our file name as a first argument, and then the data as a second argument. The data which we pass into write data here. And therefore now finally, with this extra mock, with our custom implementation here, we can go to our test and actually change it and change our expectation here. Here we can now expect that fs write file is of course called, but it should be called with certain arguments. And the first argument should be the test file name. Now, thanks to our changes to path, that should be the case. The second argument should be the test data. And if we save this all now, and we then run our tests again with npm test, this passes. And if we were to change our code here in io.js, and we somehow forget to add the file name here, then our test will quickly catch this if we run it again, because of how we adjusted the third-party code, path join, and write file to our needs with help of mocks. And that is the idea and power of mocks, that you can get rid of unwanted behavior, and you can even add behavior that simplifies your life when you write tests. Of course, you should always be careful, though, to not replace any logic that's crucial for the code. So you don't want to write a test that is totally unrealistic and has nothing to do with the production code. But that's not the case here in this example. Instead, we now can write a very helpful test because we're using mocks.